As I was sort of maturing, I was struggling with my own sense of um, identity a little bit. Like, how does this sort of wellspring of interest and expression in a kind of artistic manner fit in a world where you're supposed to be a tough guy? It was a bit of an unusual path into the business. Um, in fact, in some ways, you'd think it never would have, never would have happened. Because when I was born in the city of Toronto, or nearby there in Mississauga. But around the age of 5, my parents moved from the city to the east coast of Canada, and I was living in a little town called Tracy, New Brunswick. It's a lot of farm fields, farms, houses by the river, and beautiful looking area. Just very far removed from what you think of when you think of a place where you're going to be really diving into the performing arts. Uh, Especially because I wasn't even going to the school in the nearby city of Fredericton, where they do a lot of that. I was going to school out in the kind of country schools out there. And I guess the reason, though, was that my mother was a former ballet dancer, and had performed all over Europe in her early years with Julie Andrews and other performers, part of the classical ballet scene. And that was all before my time, and it wasn't something I even necessarily particularly related to. I mean, I did, from the standpoint there were all these images, these photographs of my mother dancing and doing these incredible performances before royalty, before large audiences all over the place. And as a guy, I kind of thought of that as my mom's thing, you know. But it was still something that affected me because my sisters, who maybe related more to it, they kind of got into dance a little bit early on. Um, and my mother kind of helped them a lot with that. Um, when we were all sitting down at night around the dinner table, and my father was there, and my father was not so much involved in the classical ballet scene, but he was an athlete. He was a bit of a performer himself. He used to do a lot of theater and ballroom dancing, things like that. When he was growing up, it was just part of his culture in the 50s and 60s to do a lot of dancing and skits and performing. And it was kind of rolled into what he was doing in high school and some of the ski shows, the comedy ski shows that he would do. Kind of combined a kind of athleticism and movement along with my mother's sort of efforts in ballet and things like that. So when they brought us into the world, and this was sort of part of their history, they weren't trying to get us into the arts. They were just living authentically as people who express themselves in kind of an artistic manner, whether that be the kind of animated skits and conversations we get into around the table, or a piece of music coming on, or us playing music with friends that would come over with their guitars at night, and the kids would we'd get up and dance, or my mother would be showing us moves with my dad and dancing, and there was just this sort of intersection of expression and movement and artistic interest that kind of sprung out of our family that way. Sometimes it could get to the point where we were pushed a little bit. If there'd be some kind of a public event going on, and my dad would kind of push me to get up and do a speech or do a skit in front of an audience, and sometimes that worked out well, and sometimes it didn't. But that sense that putting yourself out there or finding a way to express ideas, stories, emotion in a format that people can relate to was just part of my upbringing. I mean, even my mom telling us stories at night, or my father telling us stories, just sitting there around them as they kind of opened up a book and began to share these things and express them in very real ways. that was the first seed, I think, that kind of got acting implanted into my chest. Uh, it kind of was at odds a bit, though, with this environment that we moved into in the country, where the the environment you grow up in that sense, is very oriented toward doing something more practical. You know, there's a lot of farming, there's trucking, there's woodsmen going out into the woods and cutting down trees, and a lot of construction work, things like that. So as I was sort of maturing, I was struggling with my own sense of um, identity a little bit. Like, how does this sort of wellspring of interest and expression in a kind of artistic manner fit in a world where you're supposed to be a tough guy, you know? And so the dancing kind of ebbed away as I got into 11, 12 years old. But I was trying to find a way to, put the pieces together. And because my dad was an athlete, because he was a guy who was in good shape and kind of looked a bit like a bodybuilder himself, when kids started showing up to kind of ask my dad how he got such big arms and things like that and what he was doing for workouts, they'd bring these bodybuilding magazines over. And suddenly I started seeing a context because, of course, one of the things that we did as a family, we'd watch a lot of movies and talk about them and what the meaning behind the story was, but also the characters. You'd start seeing these characters appearing on the screens in the 80s that had all these big muscles. And so I guess that was where I saw a fusion happening, where I could kind of relate to my environment, to who my father was, to what I was trying to protect, I guess, in a way, about myself and what it meant to be me. Because everyone, if you got a good father, you often want to grow up to be like your dad. And I also had this part of me that came from my mom that had a lot to do with the performance part and everything. And suddenly there was bodybuilding, where you create these characters of muscle, and that desire to put that in the context of story. It was the beginnings of that starting to crystallize.